Making drums on the Modular. For my kick, I'm going to use a Belgrade filter. I think it's a good choice because it self-oscillates and it has two resonant peaks that I think can, I don't know, I'm interested in the possibilities of getting them to play off one another. Run the filter's output into a VCA. And I'm using the amplitude VCA because it has drive and saturation, and we're going to want a lot of that to make a good kick drum. And VCA's output to mix input 1. Turn up the resonance until the filter self-oscillates. So this filter is cool and kind of unique because it has two resonant peaks that can be offset with the span knob. Let's just hear what it sounds like. So the span knob offsets them symmetrically from the center point, and the balance knob shifts the emphasis from the low peak to the high peak. Also, the peaks can cross-modulate each other in two different ways. So I'm going to use a couple different envelopes for this kick drum. The first one is going to be really tight and snappy. We're going to use it to bend the pitch on the filter, or I guess it's kind of an oscillator now. And we're going to use it to open up the VCA, which will drive the attack on the saturator and make it crunchy. And I'll mult that envelope to the filter's FM input. Start up PAMs at 80 BPM. Take channel 1 and set it to multiply by 4, so we're getting 16th notes. And use it to trigger envelope 1. I'm going to thin it out, make it a little more interesting by making this Euclidean pattern. Make it 16 steps long with 5 triggers. I want to push this VCA pretty much as hard as I can, so I'll bring up the CV level and saturation. By adjusting the offset versus the CV level, we have control over how much saturation is applied to the signal's attack versus its tail. This is all static, just the offset is open and the CV is being ignored. Here we're just really saturating the attacks. This is somewhere in the middle. So I have this balance knob skewed a little bit to the left of center, meaning that it's favoring the low peak over the high peak. We're not hearing the high peak. Let's center it out and hear both of them. Play with the span. Now that high peak is pretty strident. But we don't actually need to hear it in order for it to have an influence on the lower peak. We can activate cross-modulation, so the high peak will have an effect on the low peak even if we're not hearing it. So I'd like a little bit more of a longer, sort of round, pitch-bendy sound to this kick drum, and I need another envelope for that because this one envelope that I'm using needs to be really tight in order to get the nice punch at the beginning of the sound. So I have envelope number 2 here, set to fire in tandem with envelope 1. That's what this little red mode is. I just want to experiment with what happens when we run it to the span control, for example. Because if the FM control that we're modulating with envelope number 1 is adjusting both peaks by the same amount, the span control is going to move them out from center and bring them back together. So I want to try a long envelope with that and see how it works. Interesting effect, but it's kind of moving in the wrong direction. So let's put it into the SPO so we can invert it. Find a good interval and then sweep it. I kind of like that. The interaction of these two envelopes, it's making like a bow, bow. It's not bad, but the saturation is a little bit heavy. Alright, so it has a nice punch and then sort of a dirty, wobbling tail. Like a mean, drunk subway rat. All right, let's get a clap going. I'm going to use my MCO as a noise source here with the wave knob fully counterclockwise. You get digital noise. Patch it into this MS-22. I love this filter for processing percussion stuff because it has a low pass and a high pass and the resonance and a lot of gain, and it can make really interesting dirty sounds when you push it hard. I'm going to take this filters out and patch it to Veils input 1. I'm going to use Veils as a couple of VCAs and also as a submixer for a few of my percussive elements before they go into the main mixer. So I'll just take that mix output and run it into input number 2 on the main mix. Open up the VCA. Play around with this, add low pass. High pass. Resonance. Let's get an envelope going on that. Take channel 2 and set the modifier to be divided by 2. And we'll use that to trigger our third envelope. And we'll use envelope 3 to open up the VCA on our clap. And it's falling on the 1 and the 3 instead of the 2 and the 4, so I'll go in and offset the phase by 50%. I want to drive the VCA a little bit harder and change the shape a little bit, so we'll switch the mode, make it a little more exponential. It's linear right now. I'm going to make a change to my PAM's channel 2, which is triggering the collapse envelope. I'm going to go in and change the wave shape. I'm going to change it to an envelope. It doesn't make any difference in terms of the actual sound of our clap, but it does give us another envelope shape to work with. And PAM's envelopes are not really that snappy, and they're kind of steppy, and they're not good for sort of like mission critical tone shaping things like bending the pitch on this kick drum. You know, they're not very adjustable, but they can be useful just as another tempo synced envelope. And I'm going to use one here to make the kick and the clap have a little bit of conversation. So I'll mult this shape out of PAM's. Run it into channel 2, the SPO, so that I can invert it. I'll take that output and run it to the balance control on the Belgrade filter. So remember, as we adjust the balance, it lets us hear the high peak. The high peak's only acting as sort of a modulator for the low peak right now, but we can bring it up to audible levels. Isolate our high peak. Yeah, I like that. That sounds mean. So I figure we'll build up all of our voices before we start modulating things and making them interesting, just so all the pieces are on the table. Next up, let's do hats. Take the pulse output of this MCO into the input of another MS-22. Patch the filter's output into channel 2 of this Veils. Bring it up. Our low pass. Our high pass. Resonance. And the difference between the pulse and the main outputs of the MCO are they both put out the same wave when the pulse width knob is all the way to one side. What happens is as you bring it in, it actually takes the main wave and it overlays a pulse wave on top of it with an adjustable width. So in this case, I have this noise coming through, and the noise out the main out that's feeding our clap isn't going to change, but the pulse output is going to now have a pitched component to it. And you can hear it degrading the noise when I bring the frequency of the oscillator down. That's just how it works. But I think it'll be neat to have the option of having a sort of pitched hi-hats if we want to. So now these hats need an envelope. So I'll go to PAM's channel 3, set it to multiply by 4. So now we have 16th notes. Run it into the amplifier CV input. So vaguely hat-like. Let's change the shape. I know I was just dogging on PAM's envelopes, but we're going to use one here. That's not bad. But I want to be able to have some fun with the time divisions on these hi-hats, so let's go back to the multiplier of PAM's 3 and we'll set it to be under CV control. Go into the CV submenu with a long press, and I'll adjust the offset until I have my 16th notes back. Looks like 33%, 32 to 34% give us 16th notes. Now I'm going to hook up an offset to CV2 so we have manual control over the multiplication division of the clock signal. Notice I only have a tiny fraction of this knob's range available because once I get past about 2 o'clock here, it basically maxes out the CV input and there's nothing else I can do with it. So let's adjust the attenuation so we have a little bit more of a usable range. What I'll do is I'll put the offset knob to the maximum position and then bring down the attenuation in software here until the maximum knob position corresponds to what I think is probably the maximum clock multiplication that I'm going to want for this pattern. All right, so it's getting us whatever insanely fast roll this is at 22% attenuation. Now, maybe I want to be able to go a little faster. Yeah. And since I'm using the bipolar CV input number 2, I can actually bring it down below 0 and it'll divide the clock instead of multiply it. I'm not sure I want to do that, but it's nice to have the option. All right, so we've set that up. I think I'd like to automate that at some point, but not just yet. I'm going to move on to setting up an effects loop right now so we can get some depth to these voices. And if you've watched the last few episodes of this, you might notice that this area is a little bit different than it has been. I was using this 10 HP to house a spring reverb module, but it was just giving me a ton of problems. The pots were really scratchy, it was noisy, there's a bunch of electrical interference in this building, so everything was really just buzzy and bad, and I kept having to move the tank around. So what I did instead was hook up an input-output module that converts line level to modular. I have that connected to a guitar pedal that has a pretty good spring emulation, and the cool thing about that was it opened up another 4 HP so I could use another filter. I don't feel like I'm missing a whole lot with that because the spring reverb that I had in here didn't really have a lot of CV control. I mean, you couldn't control the feedback or the wet dry or anything. You could only control the sort of filters, gain, and frequency, which I could see uses for that, but I never cared to use it that way, so I don't really mind just having a static spring reverb set up outside the rack without CV control because I never really had much CV control anyway. And it's digital, so it doesn't hum, it doesn't buzz, it sounds really nice, and you have things like control over the decay time, which over a physical spring you don't unless you start packing cotton balls in there or rubber bands, and that's a lot of fun. I'm going to use this Tangle Quartet, 4 VCAs and a mixer, as a send to my reverb tank, my virtual tank. And I guess I'll grab a single output from channel 2 here, which is the submix right now of my clap and hats, and run it to channel 1 on the Tangle Quartet mixer. I could do more or less the same thing by multing this output, but if I don't have to use a stackable, I'd rather not. Then I'll take my reverb's output and run it back to channel 4 on the main mix. Let's open up the send and see what we get. Nice. And one thing I love doing with a reverb is feeding it back into itself. So I'm going to molt this reverb's return. Oop, looks like I forgot to put a screw in this mixer. Just flopping around. I'm going to molt this reverb's return and put it into channel 4 of my Tangle Quartet so that we can actually feed the reverb back into itself. Got to be careful with it, it can get away from you and it gets a little bit clippy, but it is a really sweet effect. You can sort of ride it and get these ghostly echoes of nothing at all. Now, right now I'm feeding the entire submix consisting at this point of the clap and the hats into the reverb tank, so that when I bring up the send, we're feeding both the clap and the hats into the reverb. I'd like to change that. I'd like to keep the hats dry. But wait, if I tap into the output here, the single output from the hats, it'll remove it from the mix. The cascaded mixer is great, but sometimes I wish I could take a post VCA output and still have it be submixed. So how about we think about it a little bit differently? And instead of saying, well, I need to feed each instrument or each voice separately into the send, what if I separate things in the time domain? If I only open the reverb send when the clap is hitting, that's all we're really going to hear, right? Well, we can automate that. I already have a mult going from my snares trigger into the balance control on the kick that makes it go bleh. So I'll just mult that again, and I'll connect that to channel 1 CV input. Bring it up, and we should only hear the very onset of the clap sent into the reverb tank. Success. Let's get into that feedback a little more. And you can do this with any reverb or delay. If you figure out a way to make a feedback path into it, you can get some really interesting results. It's an old dub mixing technique. I gotta figure out where in the signal path this thing is distorting. I'll do that later and get back to you. A little bit of crunch doesn't actually bum me out too much right now. So now, because of the way that the kick and the clap are kind of talking to each other, there are two components that we hear when we hear the clap sound. We hear the but we also hear the from the kick drum oscillator when the snare drum brings up the balance. And I think that would sound really nice sent through the spring tank. So I'll mult that kick drum, grab it right on its way into the mixer, send that to channel 2 in the Tangle Quartet. I like that when I control it manually. So let's automate that too. I could try just using the same CV from the snare drum's trigger envelope, but I think it might be a little too snappy. It won't get enough of the sustain of that froggy sound. So I want to make another shape out of Pam's. And I'll just mirror the timing of the snare drum, but I'll use a different shape. So divide it by 2. I'll change the phase to 50%, bring down the width a little bit so it doesn't capture the transient of the next kick strike. And I'll patch that shape to the CV input of channel 2. That's actually not bad. Let's hear it with the clap. And now that we're feeding the clap into the reverb, it's taking a very short event and extending it in the time domain. So any small differences in that very short clap will be magnified and extended by the length of the reverb, which at this point is about 3 seconds plus a little feedback. So I want to add a little subtle modulation to that. I'll take a trigger, any trigger will do. I'll just take a mult out of the kick's gate. Feed that to Ornament Crime, have it generate some random values, and I'll send one of those stepped randoms to the filter frequency on the clap filter. Let's bring in a little bit of random. It's already kind of a squirrely system with the noise going into this sort of unstable filter, so I'm not really sure that I even care that much about having this modulation here, but, you know, worst case, I just turn it off. Let's bring in the hat, see where we're at. You know, what I thought I was going to be able to do by controlling the multiplication division of this remotely was emulate the thing that I really, really, really love in Mutable's Marbles in the second, like, orange mode, where one half multiplies and the other half divides, and you get these beautiful rhythmic variations. And there's something going on in software that I just can't seem to emulate with Pam's, and it's really making me miss my marbles. So for our last voice, I'm going to make some FM Space Bongos. So I'm going to use 2 oscillators from the Trident. Any 2 oscillators will do. Take a triangle output, run it into a low pass filter. Bring the filter's output back to the veils, run it into input 3. I'll take a second oscillator and use it to frequency modulate the first oscillator. So oscillator number 2 is my modulator, oscillator number 1 is a carrier. And we're going to make some sort of tune percussion with that. I want to clock it, set up a pattern, so I'll take channel 8 out of Pam's, multiply it times 4, Euclidean sequence, 8 steps long, with 3 triggers. Have that trigger our 4th envelope, and the 4th envelope is going to go to the CV input on RVCA, and also to the filter's FM input. Alright, we need some pitch variation there, so I'm going to use the sequencer. Quarter note out from Pam's and use it to clock the ER101. Go to a track. Let's use track 2. Insert a step. Let's make this real simple. Multiply that quarter note times 24, so I have a 24 pulse per quarter note signal to work with. Probably won't need it here, but it's nice to have it. I'll make my step 12 pulses long, so it's eighth notes. And let's make this sequence 9 steps long, make it a little weird. I'll do a math operation where I randomize the entire track, randomize every step in the track between 0 and, I don't know, 36. That's 3 octaves. So I have an 8-step sequence with 9-step sequence with random voltages on every step. Run it to our volt per octave input on the carrier oscillator, see what we get. It sounds a little cheesy with the filter all the way open, but I want to keep it low, I want to keep the envelope pretty tight, and I wanted to sort of have this be mostly feeding the reverb. Messing with the envelope's decay time is a lot of fun. So I'm going to grab this signal on its way out of the filter and mult it to the reverb's input. And as usual, the really delicious thing to me is when we have contrast. Like I like having a few dry hits and then a really washed out verby hit. If they're all fed through the reverb, it starts to sound kind of same. Let's see, I'm running out of Pam's channels here, but let's... I'll use another sequencer channel for that. Go to channel 3. I'll make an 8-step sequence with 16th notes. There it is, counting away. I'll turn down the VCA, run the output of my sequence in to control that VCA. Let's bring up a few of these steps so that it's sending to the reverb on a few steps, but not all of them. I'll kill the kick so we can hear this a little more clearly. And maybe I don't want it completely dry on those other steps, so bring up the CV on 1. And because of the fact that the pitch CV feeding the bongos is a 9-stepper, and the rest of this is all on sort of a 4, 8, 16 bass, the pitch of the step that gets the reverb in each repetition of the loop is going to be a little different. Now I'd like to bring a new character into the mix here, this delay. I'm going to grab the submix that consists of our clap, hi-hats, and space congas, and I will run it through this delay on its way to the mixer. Take the delay's output, patch it back into channel 2. And things are much as they were. Let's kill the kick and listen to what this delay is doing. Feed it back. And by default, it takes the third tap of the delay output and feeds it into the feedback loop, but we can take tap 1, make it shorter. Tap 2. Now I want to automate the delay time. I'm thinking quarter notes is good. So running out of clock sources here, so I'll just duplicate the quarter note that's going into my sequencer. Use it to trigger another channel on the ornament crime. So now it's generating random values for us. And I'll patch that stepped random value that's updated every quarter note into the time control. Let's bring it back all the way dry. It's a cool effect, but it's a bit much when it's happening all the time. So what I'd like to do is take this wet delay and use it as a ramp up to the clap. You know, you'll do that maybe in a DAW sometimes or on a drum machine, where you'll take a clap or a snare and then reverse it and put it on the beat before your 2 and 4 so that it sort of has like a sucking sound that goes into your clap. I don't want to do that, and I could use a noise source. I could use the reverb feed, I guess, but I want to use the delay. And for that, I need a very specific shape of sequence, and this is something the sequencer is good for. I'll make a sequence that is 8 steps long, and what I want to make is a shape that's flat, but that has a little ramp up to each snare hit. So it's the 4 step on here I'm going to want to make high. Let's do that. And take that CV and run it to the mix CV over here. So we'll be blending in some of the wet signal with the dry. There are other ways to do this. I mean, I could just have this on its own loop with a VCA or whatever, but this works pretty well. And I love the way the wet dry knob works on here, and I wish that more devices were like this. So from fully counterclockwise to 12 o'clock, we're bringing in the wet signal, but we're not bringing down the level of the dry signal at all. Once we get past 12 o'clock, the level of the dry signal starts to come down. I think that's a really cool implementation. You know, wet dry knobs can be really tough sometimes because, you know, the volume of your dry signal you might want to keep constant, but as you're adjusting the blend, you know, it'll, if you go wetter, the dry signal gets quieter, and it's a little bit annoying. You have to do some volume adjustments at the same time. So nice job, y'all. So let's automate that. This is cool. You can hear on step 4 of the sequence that it brings in a little brrr right before the snare. If I go to step 3 and have it slide, it'll actually ramp up to that value. Change the duration a little bit. And maybe I'll make the effect a little more pronounced. I did say we'd get back to these hi-hats, spice them up a little bit. As of now, I'm just controlling the clock multiplication manually with this offset knob. But I want that to be a little more orderly. And there's also a lot of divisions in there that I'm not crazy about. There's some of them work, some of them don't. So I can have that under some kind of random control, but I find that a lot of times it gets me divisions that I'm not interested in. So I'll disconnect the offset. That's interesting. When I first set this up, I was getting 16th notes out of this with the offset setting, and I'm pretty sure I have video evidence of that, but I don't know, maybe something's changed. No worries, we'll go into our CV menu and adjust the offset. I'll go to track 1 of my sequencer, patch the sequencer track to the CV input that's controlling our clock multiplication. Okay, so now this is 5 steps long, 5 quarter notes. So since it's an odd division and doesn't really fit in with the math of the patch, it should move the rhythmic variations around in what I hope is a cool way. Let's go. That's not bad, but it feels busy to me. And this is one of the best uses that I've found for the logic that's built into PAMs. Find an unused channel, how about 7? Keep the modifier at 1x, change the phase so that it's at 50%, up, and it's just a 50% duty cycle pulse wave. I'm gonna go back into channel 3 here. That's what's controlling our hi-hats. I'll go to the logic section, and I'll set up and logic with channel 7. So the only time our hi-hat channel is triggering anything at all is when channel 7 is high, which is on our offbeat. What I think I'm gonna do with channel 7, you know, the logic that's opening and closing our sort of hat gate, maybe I'll just make it a little bit wider so that that last hit that comes in on the 1 and the 3 doesn't get cut off as aggressively. Yeah, I think I like that hat better when it's not so bright.